Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Weingarten. I'm the Product Development Coordinator at NCII. And thank you all for joining today. I'm happy to be with you all today to talk about readiness to implement data-based individualization. So I'm just going to kind of get us started and provide a brief overview of the webinar, and then I'm going to we'll do some brief introductions, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. So just as a little bit of background about why we're talking about readiness, one of the reasons is that we often focus with DBI at the student level. So we're often focused on kind of what can we do to improve student outcomes with DBI, and that makes a lot of sense. But we also need to think about the implementation process itself. So we have a couple guiding questions up here on this slide. We want to think about creating the conditions so that educators can be successful with DBI. So that's really the kind of big picture topic that we're talking about today is creating those conditions for success. And so, one of our guiding questions is, how can we plan DBI implementation so that it has the greatest chance of positively impacting the students who need it? And then how can we make DBI implementation systemic and sustainable? So in our webinar today, we're really focusing in on building systems, building infrastructure so that DBI really becomes, like it says here, systemic and sustainable. We really want to build our processes and our infrastructure for DBI. So that's just a little bit of the big picture about what we're talking about today. We have some guests with us today. Like I said, my name is Zach Weingarten. I'm the Product Development Coordinator here at NCII. And I'm going to ask Amy to come on next to introduce herself, and then Steve will be next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy McConnell, and I am the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Hood River County School District. Prior to that, I was a vice principal at an elementary school and a learning specialist. And I'm really happy to be here with all of you this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Goodman, and I'm a research specialist at the University of Connecticut. And I've had the great fortune to support NCII as an advisor for the past number of years here. And I'm going to kick off the next portion here. So my role is kind of to set the stage with a little bit more depth around readiness. And I'd like to talk about, first, why spend time with readiness? And I think we've all have experienced situations where somebody has a new idea and here's a new initiative and we should implement it, and without much preparation for it. And often that may result in things such as false starts. You try it out and you haven't really prepared for it, and then it doesn't go very well. And it's really difficult to recover from false starts. So what we want to spend some time is to guard against those concerns. We also want to make sure that we increase confidence that database individualization is the right thing to do and that we can do it with fidelity, meaning can we do it consistently and correctly over time as the program is intended to be implemented. We also want to address both adaptive and technical concerns. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, adaptive is looking at values and beliefs, where technical concerns are, the research base, or is there technical scientific, confidence in what the program entails. We also want to promote correct and consistent implementation of DBI with the understanding that fidelity really leads to meaningful outcomes. We can't expect to get the outcomes, the success of DBI if it's not implemented well. And finally, the next two things, we really want to increase the likelihood of sustainability, because we really want to get to accessing all students who really need these services, the extra support. And we can't do that unless it takes place over time and it's scalable across our schools, our districts, or our states. So that's a little bit about why looking at the importance of readiness. We also know that it's really a process for implementation. And some of you may be familiar with different phases of implementation or stages of implementation. We kind of summarized it into three components here. Getting ready, and getting ready would be like exploration, adoption, installing, preparing for training. And then getting started would be actually trying it out and doing it. And then getting better would be once it's implemented, how do you improve over time? So with this focus on implementation process and the exploration adoption, we really want to develop clear understanding of what's to be done, how to do it, and the resources and timelines for doing it correctly, and then to commit to implementing the whole process. So some of you may be familiar from the National Implementation Research Network. They use something called a hexagon tool. We modified it just a little bit here. And what we have broken it down is to say, it's important to look at the student need, the evidence that this program will be effective, the fit within our current initiatives or our current settings, the resources available to implement, usability, is this something that's practical to implement within our settings, and do we have the capacity to implement it? What we'd like to suggest is those can be broken apart to kind of two main categories. Is it the right thing to do? Like, should we really be doing this, based on student need, based on effectiveness? And secondly, can we do it in the right way? Because even if it's a really good program, if we cannot pull it off, it may not get the outcomes that we hope for. So can we do it in the right way? Looking at, do we have the capacity? Do we have the resources to move forward with implementation? So when we talk about, is it the right thing to do? I mentioned earlier, looking at the need. Well, really, are there data to illustrate that the opportunity for improving outcomes with our student is there? So is there also a perception of need? Like, do our educators say we need to do something different, or else we won't get the outcomes we want? Do we hear from our students that they need different types of supports? Do we hear from our families? And really, is the work of implementing relevant to addressing our needs? Is it really connected with what we're trying to accomplish? And a couple other areas to go a little deeper. Is it the right thing to do? Does it fit within philosophy of culture of our school staff? Is there alignment within our values? And I mentioned earlier that the adaptive issues talk about philosophy, talk about value, talk about the culture. And so is there room for this work to take place within what we're trying to accomplish? And is it usable? Again, do our staff really perceive this to be practical? Particularly right now, you all are experiencing this as we recover from the pandemic. There are a lot of stresses going on. Educators are overloaded. Our students are feeling overwhelmed. How do we make sure that we're not just adding one more thing on, but this is something that will be a tool to help our students succeed? Now, when we look at doing it in the right way, again, do we have the capacity? Do we have the individuals who have background knowledge, who understand what DBI is? Are they willing to implement the DBI data-based individualization process? And do we have the ability to provide professional learning? Do we have the supports for this? Is there a team to help with the implementation? Will administration support DBI? And we know that there should be alignment across all these things to be effective to move forward. Now, one thing to consider when we look at this is there's possible pitfalls and possible solutions to implementation. And this is looking at specifically the exploration adoption. So one thing to consider when we implement new programs, we often hear people say, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And is it going to be successful for us? Will it get the outcomes we want? So the perception is there's a lot more effort. Now you ask me to do one more thing. I don't know if it's even going to work. So what we need to do is to address that pitfall is to highlight the direct link between that initiative, that DBI, and successful outcomes for our students. Saying, look, we may not feel that we're successful now. Adding something else will not be good unless it's really tied into making the outcomes we have. So that's one thing to help move forward. We also sometimes hear the pitfalls where people say, look, we've already did this, or we've had similar initiatives before. Why would this be different? Why should I trust, this to move forward? And what we look at for addressing those pitfalls, that particular pitfall, is to explain, why is this different from what we've done in the past? Well, one way it may be different is because we're spending time looking at readiness and exploration and really preparing to implement well. Another way we address the pitfall is to really establish an exploration team. So it's not just somebody from outside saying, you should be doing this. I think we've all experienced concerns where somebody's trying to sell us something or wants us to do something. And what we don't know is, do other people really believe this is the right thing for our school, particularly my colleagues and myself, if I were to be involved in the exploration team. So that exploration team helps to look at capacity around funding, resources. Do we have time allocated for it? Do we have the skills that we can pull it off? So those are just some ideas for looking at pitfalls, solutions within the exploration adoption. And I'm going to turn it back to Amy.
All right, and you can click it to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I was asked to come here and just kind of speak from a school perspective and how we implemented this system. So I'll just go back to how it started for us. In Hood River County School District, we began this process in 2013. We call it individual problem solving, but it's very similar. In the beginning, our systems were primarily focused around literacy in our 5 elementary schools. So that was kind of how we chose to focus on that area first. We knew we needed to move in this direction because we really didn't have a common understanding of a clear way to determine which students needed additional support and then how to support them. So we were really guessing, and we knew that guessing would never result in predictable outcomes for our kids. There you go. So building the system, we had the bones of a system. Our students were being assessed and we were collecting data, but we really didn't have clear decision rules, and our systems were still being developed. In addition to that, we did have reading specialists in each elementary school. We had school schedules that supported an intervention block outside of our core instruction. And then we also had a pretty comprehensive menu of intervention programs that we were using to intervene with students. So we kind of had some of the things already in place. We weren't moving it in a really systematic way. So at that point, our district level teams came together regularly to learn and build a comprehensive MTSS handbook. And then the district level teams included the building administrators, reading specialists, learning specialists. Those teams then went back to their school sites to provide PD and build a capacity within the school setting. So that kind of brought us to that phase that Steve was talking about, like, can we implement this? What do we already have in place? Do we have the buy-in from our staff? And that's kind of how we got to that place in Hood River County School District.
So I'm going to talk about the next part. So when we first we started this out by talking about exploration and adoption, making sure that this is the right thing to do. Can we do it in the right way? And once we have made a commitment to implement DBI, the next part of this is to really focusing on the installation. How do we set up to make sure that the conditions are right so that the staff can start implementing, DBI process? So we really need to set up this infrastructure, developing the skills to implement, providing resources for the DBI implementation. So when we do this, one thing to consider is to make sure we have room for the work. Now, we talked about pitfalls where there's so much going on right now in education. Educators are overwhelmed. So what we do know is that we have to take some things away. Some people have used the idea that for every new initiative you have, you probably should take 2 away because they have been built up over time. So when you're taking away things, we call it a deselection. a deselection is we have too many demands. What can we take things away from that? Some people have looked at even a deselection process by saying, well, you heard about pilot projects. Maybe we can do a reverse pilot by saying, well, let's not talk about something anymore and see if anybody even notices that. And if nobody even pays attention, it may not have been something that's important. So again, a more structured way is certainly to talk about where are things that are we getting the effects we want? How can we combine? We also need to make room for the work by aligning our systems so that they are more likely to be implemented correctly, sustained over time. Alignment, maybe connecting it with our current initiatives by making sure that people understand how these fit together, making sure that we leverage our funding, training, evaluation to improve DBI implementation. We also have to, as part of the installation process, identify who's going to be implementing DBI, who are the team members, who are the interventionists, who are those that are going to support implementation efforts. And so we know that implementation is really much more effective with a team than just individuals. And with a team, we want to make sure we have people on there who understand, the student, understand what their skills are, what their strengths are, understand what DBI is and how do we intensify interventions, make sure that somebody's on the team to understand the context where the intervention takes place. Because it's really easy to come in and say, hey, do this program without understanding, boy, that's a lot of work, or I don't understand how to implement it. And don't ask me to do this unless you help support me. We also need somebody who can ability to assign priority, allocate resources, and that's typically administrator or the administrator's designee. Now, we also know that if this is a program where folks do not understand, all the steps for it, we need to make sure we plan for professional learning. We identify what that professional learning content is, what will we be talking about for a database individualization, who's the providers of the professional learning, who's going to do the training, who's going to be receiving that, is what training is going to be provided for the interventionists and for the intervention team. And certainly we want to make sure we schedule access for professional learning, along with provide coaching and feedback and technical assistance. One thing that we do know is that training will not be sufficient by itself to get the outcomes in most cases, because once you have been trained in the process and you try to implement it, you will be faced with challenges that you didn't expect and that you did not hear about in training. So that's where the technical assistance, that's where the coaching helps to provide more support. And it's really essential when we look at the topics that would be involved in the training. So the topics certainly are going to be the DBI process. It's going to be looking at using assessment, collecting assessment, using assessment for decision making, and what are the intensive intervention practices that we need to look at. Another concern is to make time to actually do the planning and doing the implementation. So yeah, we allocate time for training, but how do we make sure that there's time for really reviewing the data, that teams can get together, that they can have structured meetings that really look at using that data for problem solving and acting on the data. And then certainly the time for working with students with the intervention. So we can have the best plan of saying we're going to implement DBI. We can train our staff for it. We can set it up that we have data collection tools that can be used, but we do not allow staff to implement it well or meet on acting upon the data and improving outcomes. And without that, we certainly aren't going to see the success. So to consider pitfalls, possible solutions for this area, a potential pitfall is, and again, this is for the installation of getting ready for DBI implementation. One pitfall, not paying attention to the need for installation or expecting staff just to do it. It's not fair just to tell staff, here's a manual, go read it, now implement it. we really have to consider supports to implement successfully and spend the effort to get these in place. Another pitfall is not providing time to get the work done. So saying, yes, you go do it, but you have to go do a DBI, but try to fit it in with your math, your science, your other supports that you're providing. So we really need to allocate dedicated staff time to install, to get the readiness components move forward. And then finally, a failure to consider how to grade the practices and existing work. So we want to make sure we look for opportunities to connect DBI with existing priorities and existing work demands, so that it's not seen as something extra to do. It's seeing that this is really part of really good education, particularly for students with persistent, intensive needs. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Amy one more time here.
All right, so now, we're in Hood River County School District. We've been working through these systems for many years. What we know now is that the system supporting DBI implementation is never done. It's never perfect. We're constantly in a state of maintenance with it. It's important to build systems that minimize the ability for drifting, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second here, what drifting means. Create and implement district assessment calendars with fidelity. So create calendars for assessments. If you do your assessments, screeners 3 times a year, if you progress monitor every 10 days, create those calendars and stick to that. That just kind of holds everybody accountable. Create meeting schedules that are followed with fidelity also. So if you're running core review meetings to determine the health of the core in your schools 3 times a year, schedule those out on the district the district calendar so that they're set in stone. Intervention meetings, we run grade level intervention meetings every 6 weeks, and I build that schedule in the spring, and it's pushed out, and everybody follows that the next school year, and we really stick to those. That's really important for the system so that you don't kind of, again, that drift away from that. Develop intervention meeting agendas that lean into decision rules and help guide conversation. So this was something that we improved upon over the last 2 years. We created intervention meeting agendas that really asked questions about progress on the specific goal for that student. So we weren't talking about things that really didn't matter in terms of whether or not that student needed to enter an intervention, intensify an intervention, or exit. It really focused all on the data, and that really helped us to make equitable decisions for students across our schools. Create supporting documents that are easily accessible and minimize guessing. Back to those decision rules. We don't want students to be in intervention that don't need to be, and we want to be able to exit students when they should be exited. And if we need to intensify and move down a path of possible special education identification, we need to do that again in an equitable way across our schools. And then develop a long-term PD plan that supports, like I said, we're always in that maintenance. We're always looking at our schools, our levels, and adjusting as we need to. And again, the system itself does eventually become the professional development. For example, as your new teachers might sit around a table at an intervention meeting where you're discussing the data and the decision rules, that is professional development for those teachers. A core review meeting, as teachers sit in those meetings, they hear the conversations about data, so that does become part of the professional development, which is nice, but you do kind of have to have that ongoing plan of who is your district leadership team, who are you bringing in to provide PD in specific areas, and how is that being relayed down to all of your teachers and all of your schools? You can skip to the next slide. Okay, so our current reality now in Hood River County School District, more than a decade later, we're still working on our systems. Our elementary schools are really focused on refining our decision rules, and we're working on a system for our multilingual learners to go through a process that meets their needs. Really trying to distinguish a language issue versus a reading disability. That's really challenging. We've, at our middle schools, we're working on trying to build a system that's a little bit more flexible. We initially tried to just kind of take our elementary system and then plop it into the middle school. And that was a good start for us. But as we're working through it, we're realizing it's a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. So we're trying to be really flexible with that. And then at our high school, we're really trying to figure out a way to build a very flexible system and provide training for our teachers to be looking at data in an ongoing way, but allow our students to get an intervention that's a little bit more flexible than like a 6-week or an 8-week intervention that really doesn't fit into a high school model. And then we've really been intentional about infusing other district initiatives into MTSS. So MTSS is kind of the big plate, and then everything else fits within that. For example, like AVID, if you're familiar with AVID, that is how we support a rigorous core instruction. So that falls into our MTSS or DBI. Integrated ELD, again, is something that supports our core instruction for all of our students. And if your ELD is English language development, if you're not familiar with that. And then we're also exploring different ways to review our data so that we can allocate resources to all of our schools on a needs-based way rather than every school getting the same. So that's kind of where we are in Hood River now.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy. And thank you, Steve, for your overview of readiness, and Amy for all that great information about your systems development in Hood River. So at this point, I'd like to turn to the NCII resource that we developed a few months back on getting ready to implement data-based individualization, which is shown here on the slide. So we developed this resource to really help folks think through some of these ideas that we've been talking about, because we recognize that this was a really critical piece of implementing DBI successfully. So we encourage you to check out this brief and kind of share it with your colleagues. I also wanted to just draw attention to the quote here from Dean Fixon, which kind of goes along with a lot of what we've been talking about, just this idea that implementation is a process. It's not an event, and that it doesn't happen all at once or proceed smoothly, at least at first. So just like Amy was talking about and Steve was talking about, this is kind of an ongoing process. And in a way, readiness can really be, something that you revisit constantly throughout your implementation process. So I'm going to go through some of the recommendations from that guide. And many of these align with what Steve and Amy have both talked about. I'm just going to kind of share our perspective from NCII on many of the same topics. So the first recommendation in the guide here is to determine the need for DBI. And Steve spoke to this already, but this idea that you want to spend some time thinking through, what is your why for doing DBI in the district? So, how will DBI support the needs of students in your district or school? What are the outcomes that you plan to improve with DBI, and really looking at your data to identify those outcomes, those areas of need, and then kind of establishing your goals for DBI based on data. And using those data sources to identify student needs. So taking some time to really think through your purpose for DBI, I think can really help build motivation, really help build buy-in and clarity about why you're doing this. And so we identified, a couple reasons for why a district or school might want to implement DBI that are shown here on the slide. So, it could be to improve the performance of students with disabilities. It might be to refine your Tier 3 process and to distinguish it from Tier 2. You might be looking to help teachers better support students who have not yet responded to evidence-based interventions, just generally. Or you could be looking to inform the design and delivery of your specially designed instruction for students with disabilities. So, I think it's just notable that some of these are sort of student level outcomes that you might want to focus on. whereas some of them are more about kind of improving your system or your educators' skills. So there are kind of different outcome levels that you might be focused on. And I think spending some time thinking through your goals for DBI and the need for DBI is really important. And the next recommendation in our guide is to establish your DBI implementation teams. And so while the previous kind of exploring the need might be done by kind of an exploration team, here we're talking about establishing those teams that will really lead this work and implement DBI with individual students. So I wanted to emphasize, as Steve was saying, we really encourage you not to develop new teams if possible, but rather to kind of enhance and add on to what you already have in place. So your leadership team, can take on this work of ensuring that implementers have what they need to be successful. Might be securing the resources or selecting the data systems or coordinating training. So those are kind of the roles of that leadership team. And then, you're going to have your child study or student assistance team or other child-focused team, which is going to apply the process to address the needs of individual students. And so, as much as possible, making sure that this is enhancing the work that you're already doing or adding on, not being seen as an additional thing to take on, but kind of building on from what you already have in place. And then once the team once you've kind of formed these teams, the next recommendation in our guide is to spend some time taking stock of current initiatives. And so Steve mentioned this as well. We think, spending some time thinking through the initiatives that you have in place that might have similar features or intended outcomes that can be aligned, will really help establish DBI within your context. And so when you think about initiative alignment, oftentimes MTSS or PBIS have many similar features as DBI and can really make sense to make sure that you're aligning your DBI process with those initiatives. And then the idea of deselection. So if there are programs that are not effective that you might consider removing, I think that's also an important topic. And then if there are any current policies or practices that present barriers to DBI implementation, the team can really spend some time reviewing those policies or practices and thinking through how to address those barriers. So for example, if students with IEPs who receive special education don't have access to DBI in your school because they don't have access to your tiered system of support, that could be a real sort of policy level problem that you need to address. So thinking through barriers like that, I think, is really critical. So this slide builds on the idea of alignment. So we want to think about how DBI aligns to district priorities, and how does DBI implementation build upon the work that educators are already doing in your district or school. So we talked about how MTSS and PBIS make a lot of sense to align with DBI. In special education services, certainly there's that strong connection with providing data-based individualization. That makes a lot of sense. I think there's also other areas where you can draw those connections with DBI. Things like the work your district is doing around family engagement. How can you use DBI to enhance your family engagement processes in the district? I think that's an important thing to consider. Or how can you use DBI to enhance equity and student outcomes? So whatever your district priorities are, really making that connection for folks explicit about the connection between DBI and these priorities, I think will really help enhance buy-in, as well as make it really clear for people why you're focused on DBI implementation. And so the hexagon, which is the exploration tool that Steve showed earlier, that's a great way to kind of think about how DBI aligns with your local context and fits in. So we do encourage your team to think about that with use that tool with DBI in mind. That could be a really beneficial process. The next recommendation in the guide is to review the infrastructure to support DBI implementation. And so when we think about infrastructure, we're thinking about the kind of systems and processes that really allow educators to be successful. So we want to set up a hospitable environment for DBI implementation. So you might consider, do we have the data systems? Do we have the assessments and interventions that we need for DBI? For DBI to be successful, we really want to make sure there's valid and reliable progress monitoring in place, for example, and making sure folks have access to those tools, know how to use those tools, can interpret and use graphs and things like that. So making sure that those kind of resources are in place. Time for intervention sessions and for data teams to meet. That's another kind of critical area. We need to make sure that there's intervention sessions happening as needed, as well as time for teams to come together to review data, to sort of conduct problem solving and go through the DBI process. And then also considering what professional learning do staff need to implement DBI with fidelity. So all of these kind of fit together as this infrastructure component. And we have a couple of links here. So one resource that we wanted to share is the DBI implementation rubric. This is a school level rubric that goes through several areas of capacity and infrastructure for DBI implementation. That's available on the NCII website. So going through that resource is one way to think about your infrastructure. And then the district capacity assessment is another resource, at the district level that you could use with DBI as your innovation in mind, thinking about your district team's ability to support DBI implementation. So those are sometimes called needs assessments or fidelity tools that could be used. And when we think about our infrastructure, again, this idea that to realize the potential impact of DBI, the process needs to be implemented correctly and consistently. So we know that, there's evidence that DBI works, but it's really only going to make an impact if we're doing it the right way. So implementers need the knowledge, the skills, information, supports, and time to assess, plan, and implement. And so you can think about these different implementation drivers that are shown here on the slide. So competency development, that's one kind of area that we need to think about. So that's developing the skills, providing that training and coaching to make sure educators have what they need to be successful. Organization supports kind of have to do with the communication systems, the data systems that you have in place, making sure that, that's all set up for educators to be able to do the work. And then, leadership, we want to make sure we're addressing challenges and barriers that arise. So these are all kind of parts of infrastructure to think about as you are getting ready. And next in the guide, we discussed developing an implementation plan with built-in feedback loops. So many of you probably, use implementation plans or action plans. I think it's a critical piece of implementation is to have a plan that documents your goals for DBI implementation. You want to have your strategies to meet your goals, as well as who's responsible, the benchmarks for success, and the timeline for completion of the goals. And so, this plan is intended to really keep the team on track. Your goals might be around things like professional learning for DBI, things like ensuring that assessments are in place and maybe that there's an assessment calendar, things like that. So there can be a variety of goals, but really having them documented is critical with implementation. As part of this idea of developing an implementation plan, We think, engaging and communicating with partners, we want to highlight that as well. So establishing communication loops among educators, families, and district and school leaders will really help, enhance that buy-in, make sure that people understand the status of how implementation is going. We want to make sure we're getting input about how to make improvements in implementation, and also celebrate accomplishments. So, even small accomplishments like improving fidelity of implementation, we want to be celebrating those kind of accomplishments to make sure, we are, sharing the successes, and that we can use those to kind of enhance and further our implementation. Next thing in the guide that we talk about is starting with a pilot project. So we have seen success with starting with a single content area, grade level, or a small number of students. So this idea of starting small, so that we can learn from a pilot project and quickly address challenges. So a pilot really helps us kind of apply learning when scaling up, as well as build support for DBI and promote buy-in. So if you can show folks that it works with a small group of students who are like their students, that's always a great way to sort of build that buy-in. Finally, in the guide, we end with this idea of committing to the process. So we think, it certainly takes time and commitment when you're implementing DBI. So I want to make sure that folks understand that it's going to take commitment, that it doesn't happen all at once. As I said, celebrating small successes, for example, the improvements in fidelity of implementation. Identifying implementation champions, so folks who are really, passionate about the work and can be used to sort of show others how to do it. I think that's a benefit as well. And then just addressing those technical and adaptive challenges that Steve talked about. So, making sure that we as leaders are addressing, buy-in, making sure we think about how teachers are doing, not feeling burned out, making sure that we are aware of all of these challenges. So with that, I know we're running, we have plenty of time now because our next section is devoted to questions. So that was kind of the main section of our presentation. And I'm going to move us to this questions or reflection section. So we're fortunate to have great presenters here. We have Steve Goodman and Amy McConnell. So please, let's have some time to discuss some ideas or questions that came up for you as we were presenting. We have about 15 minutes left. So with that, I'm going to see if what we have in the Q&A pod or any other questions. Feel free to take this time now to put in any other questions that you have. So I'll ask a question, and then any of the three of us perhaps can respond. Okay. So the first one that I see here is, how do you go about onboarding brand new staff? I know you mentioned the district PD becomes the system, but are there additional supports or coaching provided to new staff? So thinking about that onboarding process. So I think maybe Amy, this one's for you.
I can jump in. So we provide new teacher training each year, and it's a 3-day training for all new teachers. And we usually have like a section committed to DBI or MTSS. And then in addition to that, we have instructional coaches in every school. So they also support our new teachers in onboarding. We are kind of considering a different way to do this because we know that new teacher training, even though it's very nice to have those 3 days at the beginning of the school year, it can feel like a fire hose of, sometimes you have a brand new teacher who's never taught before and they're getting all of this information. So we'd like to consider adding in addition to that for our new teachers some built-in days throughout the school year that are devoted to some topics such as this, that are, once they've had some experience in their classroom, they might be ready to access it a little bit better. So currently we have the new teacher training, we have the coaches, they have, several different specialists within the school that could support with that. But again, it's not perfect yet. So we're hoping that moving forward, we'll have a little dose of it at new teacher training, coaches can support, and then have some additional trainings throughout the school year for new teachers.
Thank you, Amy. Let's see. I think we had an additional question in the chat that I wanted just to ask folks here. So do we have any recommendations for, let's see, tracking all the moving parts, keeping data calendars, action plans together? So I don't know, Amy or Steve, anything on that one?
I can start, Steve, and I don't know if you can chime in after that. It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. A couple things that we've done in our district, in terms of just data, we have several platforms that we use to kind of keep the data together. So we have a platform called MClass because we use Dibbles. And then we have a platform called iReady because we use the iReady assessment tool. So those are kind of two of our big platforms that we use at the elementary level. And then the reading specialist in our school really becomes the keeper of the data, and they are the ones that create the intervention meeting agendas. They create the core review meeting agendas. So everything is kind of housed in those places. And then in terms of all of the assessment calendar, the meeting calendar, we have parent letters that we've written that, they are on a kind of a document that gets sent to families. We have decision rules, we have our handbook. So I created just a one-pager document, and everything is linked on that one page. And then as we move through the process or we create something new, I had a teacher just email me the other day. She was like, hey, it would be really nice if we had this, I forget what it was, on the one pager. And then I just keep that one pager. We have kind of like a one-stop curriculum and instruction document where everybody knows that's where they can go to get these resources. So again, I don't think it's perfect yet, but we just try to make everything really easily accessible to people. And then if you have that for the data side of it, if you have that person that's kind of the expert in the school that knows how to navigate those systems, that's really important too.
And just to build on what you're saying, Amy, I think you said so many important parts. Just to emphasize, one, I think we don't need to make it more complicated than it is. So adding on multiple electronic database versions is going to be difficult. Like you mentioned, focusing on just a few, I think is so important. I think the second thing is really important is what you said, is to assign somebody to be accountable for doing that, for accountable for making sure the information is there, analyzing the data. I think the third thing that I might suggest is, and you brought this up, is what is the big picture so that we could see year at a glance type of thing. What's the whole thing of how this is all going to fit throughout the year, the training, the assessment periods, the reviews, but also how can we bring it down to what would it look like for the review period of a week period, for example? What is the process for that? So I think all that's important. And I think that even ties into the earlier question, how do you onboard new people? Because we'll have new interventionists come in, a student will need something new in the middle of the year. So how do we connect that all?
Great. Thank you, Steve and Amy, for those responses. Appreciate that. Looking at the chat, and there is a question in the chat about suggestions for decision trees that can be used for specific areas. For example, in reading, it might be screen for fluency, then move to phonics if that's an area of concern, and so on. I don't know if either of you, Amy, are you using anything like that in your district related to sort of your system for helping folks kind of move through the process?
So we screen every student 3 times a year. So every student, K-8, we screen our K-5 students, we use Dibbles, and then our 6-8 students, we use the STAR assessment. So I'll speak to it's a little bit easier to understand with the elementary school. So we use that initial screener to identify the bottom 20% of our students. And then the reading specialists along with the grade level teams, they take a look at those students, and then they look at the individual measures. So for example, if there's a student that's performing 2 or more grade levels below in nonsense word fluency, that would tell us that they need support with decoding. So then they would be placed in a particular intervention group that would be using a research-based intervention program to support that lagging skill. So someone asked, I think also in the chat, like, who does the intervention and who teaches those? So for us, we have that reading specialist, but in addition to that, when you talk about resource allocation, we have several instructional assistants that work in that classroom alongside the reading specialist so that they can be running like 4 or 5 different groups based on students' skills. So then if a student is in an intervention group that's focused on decoding, we are really only progress monitoring the lowest level skills. So we're not necessarily progress monitoring everything. So once that student has made progress on that skill, and they're based on their aim line, so they're making progress on their rate of improvement and closing the gap to grade level, performing at grade level, that's when we get into those decision rules of, okay, are we ready to exit them? Do we need to continue the intervention as is? So that's all kind of developed. And that's when I was talking about that intervention meeting agenda. Those are the questions we ask. When they bring a student to an intervention meeting that needs to be discussed, we're asking, is there progress on or above the aim line? Is it below the aim line? So the questions are specifically on that data point and whether or not they're making the progress that they should be. So that really helps you to make decisions. And then sometimes they might move to a different group that is, more focused on fluency or something like that. Or we might exit that student. They might go back into the classroom. Does that kind of answer that question?
That's great. Thank you, Amy. See a couple other questions coming in. So this next question about, do any schools have interventionists who are solely employed for DBI? I wonder, I guess, Amy, again, if you want to speak from your experience, unless Steve, maybe you might know about this as well, but I don't know if Amy, you want to talk about that?
So again, we have prioritized this work for a very long time. And so we've allocated a lot of resources. At our elementary schools, we have a full-time reading specialist. So that person, they teach the reading group. So they're teaching all day, but they manage the system, really. That's kind of their job. In addition to that, we have an instructional coach that also supports with that. We also have vice principals at our elementary school. So that's like a lot of people that are supporting this work. At our middle schools, we did hire student achievement specialists, and they really are kind of the MTSS systems person for the middle schools. They also teach a little bit, but because the system is a little bit different at the middle school, they don't necessarily teach all day long. So yeah, it's kind of, that's the model we've run. But again, as you're in this maintenance and as, just things in education change, we're always trying to, just the paperwork that goes along with this, you probably could have someone solely assigned to the management of the system, because that's where really something we're grappling with right now is our reading specialists who are teaching all day are then mining the data, preparing the intervention meeting agendas, going through, we call our form is called an individual problem solving worksheet, which is very similar, but it's very a lengthy process and it's a lot of paperwork. So I think the way we're doing it is better because we have allocated more resources, but it is a struggle to for someone to do all of that and manage it.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy. I think we have time for perhaps one additional question, and then there was one that came in about let's see here. It was about multilingual learners or English language learners. So the question was, can you expand on using DBI to help multilingual learners or ELLs achieve their learning and language goals? And I think making this connection is important when trying to promote the ideas of adopting and implementing DBI in settings with large populations of ELLs like my school. So I don't know if either of you have sort of thoughts or feedback on using DBI to help multilingual learners. I know we have a resource from NCII, which we're happy to share on that as well. But if either of you have thoughts on that one.
I can start off and pass it on to you. I think early on in the discussion today, we talked about how it's very important to have somebody who knows the child. And I think, the whole process of database individualization, it's really looking at intensifying needs for the students and intensifying supports for addressing those needs. And it's identifying what those needs are, having that person who understands that student, understands that family, understands the culture that they're coming in, the context, is really helpful for moving forward. I think other things are that we also need somebody who understands what are effective interventions for students who are English language learners. So by having that team built up of all those different perspectives, and not excluding the student from that or the parent or family as being part of the team to understand moving forward. I think that's a way to really strengthen the approach to continue success. But I pass it on to you guys. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
We are actually doing a lot of work around this in our district right now because it's challenging, and it's challenging to determine the needs of a language learner when they're you're comparing them to a monolingual to a bilingual student. So when we're looking at a rate of improvement, we need to look at that differently for that student. So that's what we're trying to work through right now. And we've been doing a lot of learning around this and working with our school psychologists to determine what is an appropriate rate of improvement for a bilingual student as compared to a monolingual, and what other checkpoints can we have along the way? For example, if a student falls into that bottom 20%, do we give it like the Woodcock-Munoz language survey to determine what their language level is before deciding whether or not they should be in a reading intervention, for example? So I know we're here at the end of the time, but I think this is a big question mark for a lot of districts. And I know that we're trying to work through it, and it is, knowing your students is so important. So that's kind of where we're at in that process.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your insights on this, and really appreciate the questions from everyone, and for your engagement in this webinar and with this topic. So we are at the end of our time. We'd love to hear from you. So please do fill out this evaluation survey. And thank you for your participation.